Hello and welcome to the NDTV Dialogues, a conversation of ideas. This week, the first month of 2017, we're debating the new normal. Well, not just us, but world leaders. The Prime Minister talked about the new normal this week in India. President Xi Jinping in Davos also brought that up. Also, the other big themes of 2017, President Trump has taken over this week. Globalization versus protectionism. Also rising inequity. And of course, the demonetization impact in India and why the world is watching. Joining me for more on that, Professor Geeta Gopinath of Harvard. She heads the economics departments there. She joins me from Davos. I'm also joined by Shaurya Doval of the India Foundation, now considered one of India's most influential think tanks. Also with me, Sadanand Dhume, resident fellow of the American Enterprise Institute, well-known political analyst. Thank you all very much for joining me. Professor Gopinath, tell us the view from Davos. I mean, really at a gathering of the world's wealthiest and also other voices speaking out about issues that could dominate the agenda in 2017. Also center stage was the India story and the India versus China story. What do you see? What's your view from Davos today?
I think in Davos, everybody is talking about whether we're going to see a rollback from globalization or not. I think the high point was the speech of President Xi Jinping of China, who seemed to be almost like a statement from a Western democracy, because he was all about free trade and globalization. So, everybody is looking forward to see what happens. I mean, there are big events. There's Brexit, that the whole proceeding starts in March. There's the new Trump administration, and people are still waiting to see what happens in terms of actual policies. China is getting a lot of attention in Davos this year. India also is. I mean, actually Andhra Pradesh, in fact, is getting a lot of attention in Davos this year with the Chief Minister Chandrababu Naidu over here. So there's a lot of buzz right now, more about what's going on in the developed world, in the US and Europe.
Right. That's an interesting perspective. And of course, the power of the states and Chief Minister Chandrababu Naidu there. Mr. Doval, when you look at that whole aspect of globalization, and Prime Minister Modi touched on that also in his speech at the Raisina Dialogue this week, he talked also about India's relationship with Pakistan and China more economically as well. How do you see this whole larger debate of globalization playing out for Indian interests?
I think from an Indian perspective, globalization will continue to be a theme for India, because India needs globalization. India is in the process of integrating and extending its influence on the global arena. So I think for India, as you said, in 2017, globalization will continue to remain a new normal, or a normal. What will be interesting to see is that what does India bring to the globalization table? What are its cards that it plays? Economic growth is definitely one of them. India's rising soft power, and particularly India's increasing influence on the eastern side of India, which is India's Act East policy, is an important part. India continues to play an important role in the region and will continue to have greater and greater influence in its neighborhood. And how does India deal with irritants like Pakistan?
No, and also, do you feel redefining globalization from an Indian perspective, as in terms of India setting the agenda? Demonetization as an idea is now being watched globally to see how it will actually work in India. Whereas other themes, in fact, we're interested in the Vibrant Gujarat Summit. You had CEOs coming here and saying tips from Prime Minister Modi's leadership are, this is the kind of leadership we'd like to see in democracies around the world. Do you think in that the definition of globalization is changing for India, not American dominated, but perhaps where India plays a much stronger role?
Yes, but it is going to be very obvious that's going to happen, because as the Indian version of globalization, as I said, it tends to, as India gets more influence globally, what India does will have a global impact, and that is globalization from India's perspective. So you talked about demonetization. Absolutely. I mean, India is probably one of the first economies, or developing economies, that is making a concerted bit on trying to overcome the problems of a shadow economy.
Well, I'm not sure they're going to wait and see how India's experiment. There may be a wait and watch, but Sadanand Dhume, if you can comment on that the Prime Minister Modi is setting an agenda which is being followed rather than following. Whether you agree with it or not, and of course the opposition at home will have many issues with it, but whether you agree with it or not, he's setting a global agenda in a sense, of setting India's role in the global agenda much stronger than it's been, say, in the last decade.
I mean, there are two separate things here. Let me sort of unpack that slightly differently. On the question of demonetization I don't think that India is setting the agenda. I think that this has been viewed outside of India's borders largely as a very risky and possibly perilous move for the economy. So I'd be very, very surprised if any democratic country in the next 5 years that is not in crisis were to emulate this particular move. Shaurya's point is well taken that people do want to see a seriousness about tackling the shadow economy. I'm not sure if people are going to be looking at this as the particular policy tool that will be used. On globalization and what it means for India, I'd sort of like to come back to Professor Gopinath's comments. I think in many ways what is most important is actually not the agenda that's being set in India, but the turmoil in the West. So we're at a moment in history where after many decades of being able to take for granted several elements of globalization, now you have turmoil with Brexit, you have turmoil with the election of Donald Trump, you have a situation where some things that we could take for granted, we may no longer be able to take for granted. So how this shakes out in terms of trade, how this shakes out in terms of immigration is going to have tremendous consequences for the whole world, including India, and at this point it's not clear to us what that's going to be.
Exactly, as I said, as the beginning of 2017, and if you look a year ahead, it could be absolutely anything. But Professor Gopinath, if you could just come in on this whole aspect of demonetization, and of course your roots very much here as well, because you're also economic advisor to the government of Kerala, which has strongly opposed demonetization. But you made that point that this is of course Prime Minister Modi's boldest policy intervention, and you also made the point that this scale of say intervention of demonetization unprecedented anywhere in the world. How is that being seen in Davos amongst discussions? Indian ministers are there as well. You've had other people talk about it. Noorel Rubini also just talked about say the benefits of going cashless. How is that being seen and played out in your perspective on demonetization and whether it's good for India?
I think the most positive spin I've heard about what demonetization has done is that it signaled very strongly that the Prime Minister of India is against black money, hoarding, the shadow economy. So it's been a good signaling device that he certainly is very keen on doing something about it. But every other aspect of that has been, I would say, frowned upon. There's been a question of bafflement. I mean, I've had several people ask me, why did they do that? The Indian economy was doing great, so why do this particular intervention? It's very risky for a country that relies so much on cash transactions to do this overnight without having the money previously printed. So a lot of the, the negatives are being brought up again over here. But as a signaling device, it's good, and of course everybody embraces the idea of going towards digital transactions, digital wallets, cashless economy. But the question is, it probably would have been possible to do that without this dramatic intervention overnight.
It's interesting you made that point, because of course coinciding with Davos this week has been that IMF report, which has cut India's growth projections by around 1%, said that we may no longer be the world's fastest growing economy. So in the wise, is that coming up as well? Are you worried about what you think growth projections would be for India and the resulting impact on say, the Prime Minister's ambitious welfare schemes and jobs?
I actually hear less concern about India's growth going down by 1 percentage point. Or, I mean, that's it's slowing down. It loses the status as the fastest growing economy. But I think people are you're not going to lose your sleep over 1 percentage point decline in growth rate. I think the bigger concern is where are these decisions coming from? What's guiding the decision making process? What's next on the horizon? And the bigger concern is also about the informal economy, which is 40% of India's GDP. And the long-lasting effects that could possibly be there in that particular sector.
Shaurya, let me get you on what Sadanand actually wrote, where he said it's resurrected fears that the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party takes policy advice from quacks. Now, the India Foundation, we know, is not a quack, but it's often said that they take advice from you as well. That the India Foundation is now the new NAC for the NDA. Is that true?
I don't think that's the correct way of putting it. And as I've always said, the policy making is completely in the domain of the government. It takes inputs from everybody, and which is exactly the way it should be. So without getting sort of talking about any particular organization's role in it, or I think it is the government of India's decision, and they must have, or the Ministry of Finance, and they must have thought through about how and why they did this.
But as a think tank, for instance, when you look at a decision like this, it's a decision you welcome, but aren't these questions that come to your mind? What was the research, what were the figures, what was the data that went into making such a drastic decision which affects so many people's lives?
Yes, and and I tend to disagree with this view that this was just a one-off decision. This government has taken a thematic view that it will go relentlessly after black money and after corruption in India. This was the 10th step in the series of steps that started with the first cabinet meeting where the SIT was constituted for tracking black money. Some of those steps were marginal or incremental, some of them were exponential. In terms of the signaling effect, or in terms of what Professor Gopinath said, the signal really is that this government, for whatever terms it has, will continue to relentlessly go after corruption and after black money, and that will be the new normal of India. Now, if it does lead to slight economic slowdown, or it leads to certain other issues, they are willing to take both the political cost of it or the inconvenience of it. In 2014, by the time we were knew this government was coming, there was a normal that was getting established in this country, which was very bad, which was to believe that we could do nothing about corruption, that it was a fight that was lost, that in this country, whether it's the politician, the bureaucrat, the industrialist, there was a collusion that was there to stay, and there was nothing. And even today, the cynical part of us actually wants Mr. Modi to lose this battle, because we believe that this is so embedded. After all, every argument that I've heard is said, look, all this money has come back, and therefore this was.
So you're saying you're saying the cynical want this to fail. Is that dangerously close to the argument who say that those who oppose demonetization are corrupt? I'm not sure, but let me get in Sadanand, because he's got a different view on that, or whatever. Go ahead,
I have a
Sadanand.
completely different view, and what I meant there was, in the context of the political history of this country, there was a time when the BJP was seen as a party that had real problems coming to terms with modern economics or market economics. This is just a historical fact. Now, over the years, starting in 1998 with the very successful administration of 1998 to 2004, NDA won, the BJP overcame that. Then you had the success of the Gujarat model in Gujarat under the Prime Minister, then Chief Minister, which also went a long way towards creating the idea of the BJP as a right-of-center, market-friendly party. Now, with demonetization, what happens is that you suddenly find that who were the people who were recommending this drastic move before November 8th? Let's be clear, there was not a single economist of repute anywhere in the world who suggested a move of this nature in a developing economy. The only people who were coming up with this idea were people from some small NGO in Pune, for example, called Arthakranti. Baba Ramdev, who I take very seriously in terms of yoga postures, but perhaps is not a leading economist in the world, with all due respect. These were the sorts of people who were recommending this before November 8th. Now, after November 8th, you're going to obviously find some people who will come out and defend it, because in any political debate, you're going to find defenders and detractors. But the fact that something of this enormity could be put into place without any kind of mainstream economic thinking behind it known to anyone has resurrected that fear. Is it a permanent fear? Perhaps not. It's possible for the government to take other steps that ease these fears and reassure people that in fact the BJP has moved in the direction that many people had thought it had moved. But did this particular policy resurrect that old fear and that old famous line by Jagdish Bhagwati, which you remember back in the 1990s, where he said, if these guys are economists, I'm a Bharatnatyam dancer. So does this resurrect the fear that the Bharatnatyam dancers are back in charge? The short answer is yes.
Well, Professor Bhagwati now has a different view, but let me just get Professor Gopinath on that as, of course, an economics professor. Professor Gopinath, just as an economist, perhaps let's just take out that way, this is after demonetization, what the aspect is currently, but as an economist, would you have thought that this was the right way to go for the Indian government? If you've been asked on the November the 7th that this is going to happen, would you have thought it's a good thing to do?
No, I would not have. I mean, very hard to recommend a policy like this for a developing country in the first place. I think you could have also preempted, I don't know, some people actually did say that a lot of the money would come back. And this other bigger concern is if you're going to do this without having printed the currency that's needed to replace it, it's a very dangerous adventure. Would not have recommended it, and I actually know very few of my macroeconomist colleagues who would recommend something like this, because it is hugely disruptive and in certain sectors of the economy could do permanent damage.
But let me ask Shorda. In fact, the Prime Minister answered this criticism in a sense when he said that if I didn't do it when the economy was strong, when people have asked why did you do it when India was seen as a bright spot, he said if I didn't do it when the economy was strong, when would I have done it? And I think the interesting thing is that how election after demonetization, the people's verdict in some sense, Prime Minister Modi has won. So it's actually been a political gamble on a major life-changing economic reform, which seems to have worked so far. So do you think in that sense perhaps the people are getting something the economists aren't?
Yes, absolutely. I think, you know,
you're an investment banker, so wear that hat as well.
I'm not going to talk about this purely from an economic angle, because I don't think this was just a pure economic move. So the economists like Geeta are better qualified to talk about it. I look at it slightly from a more holistic perspective. This action, as you rightly said, was also a big signaling effect, was a signaling tool that, you know, we are going to go after corruption, as the Prime Minister said.
Professor Gopinath said that, I didn't say that, yeah.
But and therefore that, you know, we will try and be relentless in our pursuit of the corrupt and of black money. So to the extent that all these people are saying that it was very dangerous and it, you know, it will lead to disruption in the India's growth story, and there may be a few quarters. If the people of India, and I'm thinking if the people of India end up politically supporting it, then everybody who has been in the last few months the spokesman of the people of India will stand to be negated in that element of the word that, you know, they were not correct in assessing that whether the people were ready to bear this inconvenience, because history is replete with the fact that nations, societies, individuals do a lot or bear a lot of pain for what they think is right and for the directions that their leaders choose. So to that extent, if Mr. Modi's fight against corruption is seen as being the correct fight by the people of India, which will then is validated through the electoral process, then I think to that extent Mr. Modi has been successful in trying to rally the country in their fight against corruption, to me, which is the larger battle, in which it's an iterative process. Some things you will get right, some things you will not get right. Sometimes your force will be proportionate, sometimes it will be disproportionate. But nobody has a textbook solution. And as he rightly said, if not this, then what?
Interesting, because I mean it's also been the battle over numbers, and the finance minister has quoted various numbers: tax collections up, life insurance up, air travel up, to show that look, the economy is not in a bad shape. But on the converse side, there are many other numbers. The CMI has come out with how investment, and they've said that new investment projects have fallen sharply. That's something, again, as an investment banker should worry. The question about slowdown in hiring, vehicle sales falling, etc., etc. You think this temporary impact, even the new IMF report, is a price worth paying?
Yes. Because there were certain other elements of the economy that were not actually taking off, irrespective of the demonetization. Now, you know, for example, employment growth. Now, this is a major agenda of any government. I don't think that as of now we have been very successful in being able to address that issue. Demonetization with or without. Now, demonetization will obviously impair it a little bit further, maybe 2 quarters or 3 quarters of it will get affected. But solving for that, in my view as an investment banker, I think that much more needs to be done. And some of it which hasn't been done and hopefully will get done. So I would not tie this purely in terms of just pure economic numbers and economic growth in terms of the next, you know, my general assessment is that this demonetization will impair growth irrespective of what the official numbers say, etc. And that this growth will be for a few quarters, and in the medium to long term, and this I'm telling you as a practitioner, Something needs to be done on the corruption in India, on the black economy, if India has got to move from a $2 trillion economy to an $8 trillion economy. This cannot continue to exist because it is such a huge X factor that completely distorts outcomes, as it has done in the past. And therefore, unless political leadership tries to address it in a big way, just to say that it's an emerging market and it's a developing economy and therefore we must live with it, means that we then must be ready to confine ourselves to not being able to ultimately reach where we want to.